Hey guys, settle in, dim the lights if you like, maybe grab a warm beverage. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time, back to a London that was a lot less cozy. We're going to talk about a winter, a very, very cold winter, and how some folks in that sprawling, gas-lit metropolis tried to make it through. No rush, no drama, just a slow wander through the historical records of a very frosty time. So picture this. It's the year 1895. The air is thick, not just with coal smoke, but with an almost unimaginable chill. London, a city already known for its fog and dampness, decided to truly outdo itself that year. It wasn't just cold, it was exceptionally cold. We're talking about temperatures plummeting, staying below freezing for weeks on end. Now for us, maybe that means turning up the thermostat and complaining a bit. But for the vast majority of Londoners at the time, particularly those at the bottom of the societal heap, this was a matter of sheer, brutal survival. The winter of 1895 wasn't just a brief cold snap. Oh no, it dug its heels in. January saw a pretty steady chill, but it was February that truly brought the misery. Imagine the Thames, that mighty river, the lifeblood of the city, actually freezing over. Yes, you heard that right. Not just a thin skim of ice, but thick enough in places for people to actually walk on. And, because why not truly embrace the bizarre, there were even reports of people roasting oxen on the ice, just like in the old frost fairs of centuries past. A bizarre, almost festive spectacle amidst widespread suffering. Now, while the wealthier classes might have found a certain novelty in the frozen river, perhaps a bracing walk, bundled in furs before retreating to their well-heated drawing rooms, for the working poor, this was an unmitigated disaster. Their lives were already a precarious balancing act, a constant struggle against poverty, disease, and the relentless demands of industrial labor. Add extreme cold to that equation, and you have a recipe for truly profound hardship. Let's consider the homes of the poor. These weren't the sturdy brick houses of the middle class, let alone the grand mansions of the elite. We're talking about tenements, often hastily constructed, poorly maintained, and utterly lacking in insulation. Thin walls, leaky roofs, cracked windows stuffed with rags, these were the realities. Imagine trying to keep warm in such a place when the air outside is hovering around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. It was, to put it mildly, an uphill battle. Fuel was a constant concern. Coal, the primary source of heat, was a commodity. You had to buy it. And if you weren't earning a regular wage, or if your meager earnings were barely covering food, then coal became an unaffordable luxury. People would buy it by the pailful, sometimes even by the shovelful, just enough to get them through a few hours. The idea of a continuously burning fire, a luxury for most, was simply out of reach. So families would huddle together, perhaps sharing a single blanket, trying to conserve whatever body heat they could. Children, of course, were particularly vulnerable. The lack of proper nutrition only exacerbated the problem. A well-fed person can withstand cold much better than someone who is constantly hungry, and in Victorian London, particularly in the East End and other working-class districts, hunger was a constant companion for many. Diets were meager, often consisting of cheap bread, potatoes, and whatever scraps could be afforded. Meat was a rarity, fresh vegetables even more so, especially in the depths of winter. So imagine facing sub-zero temperatures with an empty stomach and a body already weakened by a poor diet. It's a grim picture. Work, too, became a casualty of the cold. Many working-class Londoners relied on outdoor labor. Dock workers, street vendors, casual laborers, their livelihoods literally froze up. The frozen Thames meant ships couldn't easily come and go, cutting off work for thousands of dockers. Construction sites slowed, deliveries became difficult, and any job that required being outdoors for extended periods became perilous. No work meant no wages, and no wages meant no money for food, no money for coal, no money for rent. It was a vicious downward spiral. And the charities, bless their hearts, were overwhelmed. Organizations like the Salvation Army, the various workhouses, and philanthropic societies did their best, but the sheer scale of suffering was immense. Soup kitchens saw lines stretching for blocks, offering a thin, watery broth that was often the only warm meal someone would have all day. Shelters filled to overflowing, often turning people away because there simply wasn't enough space. The workhouse, that dreaded institution, became even a starker reality for those with absolutely nowhere else to turn. Entering the workhouse meant giving up your freedom, enduring harsh conditions, and often being separated from your family. But for many, facing starvation and freezing to death on the streets, it was the only option. Let's take a moment to imagine the sounds of this frozen city. The usual bustling noise of London, the clatter of horse-drawn cabs, the cries of street hawkers, would have been muffled by the snow and the intense cold. Instead, perhaps you'd hear the creaking of ice, the distant clang of a church bell, or the quiet, desperate coughs of those succumbing to bronchitis and pneumonia. The air would have been heavy with the smell of coal smoke, yes, but also perhaps the acrid tang of poverty, of unwashed bodies and damp, decaying tenements. The cold didn't just cause discomfort, it killed. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and other respiratory diseases soared during that winter. The elderly and the very young were particularly susceptible. A simple cold could quickly escalate into something fatal when the body was already weakened by a poor diet and constant exposure to the bitter air. Infants, in particular, wrapped in insufficient rags in unheated rooms, often didn't stand a chance. The mortality rates, especially for children under 5, would have seen a significant spike during those frigid months. One of the more peculiar aspects of that winter from a purely logistical standpoint was the impact on transportation. As mentioned, the Thames freezing over caused major disruptions, but beyond that, the streets themselves became treacherous. Horse-drawn vehicles struggled on the icy cobblestones, leading to accidents and delays. Public transportation, already rudimentary by modern standards, became even less reliable. For those who had to walk to work, often for miles, the journey itself became an ordeal, a constant battle against slipping, falling, and succumbing to hypothermia. And then there was the aesthetic of it all. Snow, when it falls in a city, can be beautiful, but when it lingers, turns to slush, and then refreezes into an icy, gritty crust, it quickly loses its charm. The streets of Victorian London, already not known for their pristine cleanliness, would have become a messy, dangerous landscape of frozen mud, horse manure, and refuse, all covered in a thin, treacherous sheen of ice. Walking, let alone navigating, would have been a constant effort, adding another layer of exhaustion to already weary lives. The cold also highlighted the stark class divides of the era. While the poor shivered and starved, the wealthy continued their lives, albeit perhaps with a few minor inconveniences. Their homes were well heated, their tables laden with food, their wardrobes filled with warm clothes. They might have grumbled about the difficulty of getting their carriages around or the inconvenience of the frozen Thames, but their fundamental survival was never in question. This contrast, often starkly visible in the city, would have been even more pronounced during such a harsh winter. The sight of a bundled, well-fed gentleman stepping out of a warm house, perhaps into a waiting and closed carriage, while a shivering, emaciated street urchin huddled in a doorway, would have been a common and heartbreaking tableau.
Let's delve a bit into the anecdotal evidence, the snippets we find in newspapers and personal accounts from the time. The newspapers, of course, presented a somewhat sanitized view, focusing on the more dramatic or picturesque aspects, like the frozen Thames and the makeshift ice fairs. But even within these reports, you can glean a sense of the desperation. There were calls for increased charity, for more government intervention, though such calls often fell on deaf ears or were met with the slow, bureaucratic grind of Victorian administration. Imagine the plight of the costermongers, those street sellers who are a ubiquitous part of London life. Their livelihood depended on being out in the elements, hawking their wares. In such extreme cold, their perishable goods would spoil, their fingers would freeze, and their customers would be scarce. Many would have been forced off the streets, losing their meager income and adding to the swelling ranks of the unemployed and desperate. The gas streetlights, which offered a flickering glow against the pervasive darkness, would have cast long, eerie shadows on the snow-covered streets. The fog, already a characteristic feature of London, would have been made denser and more biting by the extreme cold, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. Visibility would have been low, and the sense of isolation, even in a bustling city, would have been profound for many. One particular hardship was the frozen water pipes. For many, access to running water was already limited, often shared communal taps in courtyards. When these pipes froze, it meant no water for drinking, washing, or cooking. Imagine the added difficulty and health risks of not being able to access clean water in freezing temperatures. It forced people to seek out alternative sources, often at public pumps, which themselves could freeze, or rely on melted snow, which carried its own risks of contamination. The workhouses, as mentioned, became a last resort. Conditions in these institutions were notoriously harsh, designed to be a deterrent rather than a comfortable refuge. The idea was to discourage idleness and force people to find work, no matter how poorly paid or difficult. But in a winter like 1895, when work simply wasn't available for many, the workhouse became a necessary, albeit dreadful, evil. Families were often separated upon entry, men in one ward, women in another, children in a third. The diet was meager, the work laborious, and the discipline strict. It was a bleak existence, made even bleaker by the knowledge that outside the city was just as cold, but perhaps offered a sliver of freedom. The churches, too, played a role, though often limited by their resources. Many opened their doors as temporary shelters, offering warmth and a cup of tea or a simple meal. But these efforts, while noble, were often overwhelmed by the sheer number of people in need. The scale of the problem was simply too vast for individual charitable organizations or religious institutions to adequately address. Consider the children. Victorian London was home to countless street children, orphans, and those simply left to fend for themselves by impoverished parents. For these children, the winter of 1895 would have been a particularly brutal experience. Without proper clothing, without a roof over their heads, without regular food, many would have perished from exposure and disease. Their small, vulnerable bodies simply couldn't withstand the relentless cold. The image of a small, shivering child huddled in a doorway, blue with cold, is one that haunts the historical records of this period. The river, that frozen Thames, became a bizarre symbol. While for some it was a source of wonder and spectacle, for others it represented a frozen lifeline, a choked artery of commerce and transportation. The traditional lively trade along the riverbanks would have ground to a halt. Fishermen couldn't ply their trade, lightermen couldn't transport goods, and the entire ecosystem of river-based commerce was temporarily suspended. This, of course, translated directly into lost wages and increased hardship for those whose livelihoods depended on the river. Even the relatively simple act of laundry became a major challenge. Without running water, without heat to dry clothes, hygiene suffered. Damp clothing, particularly in unheated homes, contributed to illness and discomfort. The cycle of poverty, cold, and disease was a relentless one, difficult to break free from. Let's not forget the sheer psychological toll of such a winter. The constant cold, the gnawing hunger, the fear of eviction, the worry about one's children, all of this would have created an atmosphere of pervasive anxiety and despair. Hope, that most precious commodity, would have been in short supply for many. The relentless gray skies, the short, dark days, and the biting wind would have mirrored the internal landscape of many Londoners, a landscape dominated by hardship and suffering. The authorities, for their part, often adopted a rather laissez-faire attitude. The prevailing Victorian ideology emphasized individual responsibility and self-reliance. While some relief efforts were made, there was often a reluctance to provide what was seen as handouts for fear of encouraging pauperism. This ideology, while perhaps well-intentioned in its own strange way, proved utterly inadequate in the face of such widespread systemic suffering. The idea was that hardship built character, but for many it simply broke them. The ice persisted for weeks, holding the city in its grip. When the thaw finally came, it brought its own set of problems. Flooding, as the frozen waterways released their pent-up waters, was a concern. The sudden shift in temperatures could also be dangerous, catching bodies weakened by the cold off guard. And the economic recovery would have been slow, as businesses gradually reopened and people tried to piece their lives together after weeks of lost income. It's important to remember that this wasn't an isolated incident. While the winter of 1895 was particularly severe, cold winters were a recurring feature of Victorian life. But each time it was the poor who bore the brunt of the suffering, a stark reminder of the deep inequalities that permeated British society at the height of its imperial power. So, as we slowly drift back from this frozen snapshot of Victorian London, take a moment to appreciate the warmth and comfort we often take for granted. The simple ability to turn up a thermostat, to have access to clean, running water, to have enough food to eat. These were unimaginable luxuries for countless Londoners in that long, bitter winter of 1895. It's a quiet, cold reminder of how much has changed and how much, in some ways, remains the same. Let's float over to another royal disaster, shall we? One that involves rather a lot of intermarriage and some interesting genetic outcomes. We're going to talk about the Habsburgs. Yes, those Habsburgs, the ones who practically invented the concept of marrying your cousins to keep the bloodline pure, which, as you might imagine, had some rather less than pure results. Imagine a family tree, but instead of branching outwards, it keeps circling back in on itself, like a snake eating its own tail, but with more crowns and less digestive efficiency. That, my friends, is the Habsburg family tree. For centuries, this incredibly powerful European dynasty held sway over vast territories, from Spain to Austria to parts of the whole Roman Empire. And their strategy for maintaining this power was simple. Marry within the family, like really within the family. First cousins? Sure. Nieces and nephews? Why not? Double first cousins? Excellent. It was a strategy designed to consolidate power and wealth, but it also, perhaps inadvertently, created some of the most fascinating and sometimes tragic genetic case studies in history.
Because of this extensive inbreeding, Charles II was, by all accounts, a profoundly unwell individual. He was nicknamed El Hechizado, which means the bewitched, because people genuinely thought his various ailments were due to witchcraft, rather than, genetics. His tongue was so large that he could barely speak, making his words almost unintelligible. He started talking around the age of 4 and didn't learn to walk until he was 8. His jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw, was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet, making chewing incredibly difficult. And, of course, this affected his speech even further. He was often sick, suffering from a litany of diseases throughout his short life. He was frail, prone to infections, and developmentally delayed. Imagine being the king of a vast empire, yet struggling with basic motor skills and communication. It was a truly tragic existence for him, caught in a body that was failing him from birth, a direct consequence of his ancestors' marital strategies. He was married twice, because a king, especially one who was struggling to produce an heir, simply had to have children to continue the dynasty. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess. She reportedly found him rather challenging, which is perhaps an understatement. She wrote to her father that she found him repulsive. Not exactly the stuff of fairy tales, is it? She died relatively young and childless. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg. Again, no children.
Charles II himself was likely infertile, a further consequence of his genetic issues. This created a huge problem for Spain, as he was the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. His death in 1700 at the age of 38 triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict over who would inherit the Spanish throne, all because the Habsburgs loved keeping it in the family a little too much. So, Charles II is perhaps the poster child for royal inbreeding gone wrong, but he wasn't alone. The Habsburgs had a long history of this. Let's rewind a bit to Philip II of Spain, who reigned earlier, from 1556 to 1598. He was a devout Catholic, a powerful ruler, and he married his own niece, Anna of Austria. Yes, his niece, again. This was a common practice, and while it might seem incredibly strange to us now, at the time it was seen as a perfectly legitimate way to keep royal lines pure and prevent territory from falling into the hands of rival families. The idea was to keep the power and the lands firmly within the Habsburg grasp. Philip II had 4 wives, and his family life was a bit of a mess. His first wife was Marie Manuela, Princess of Portugal. She died giving birth to their son, Don Carlos. Now, Don Carlos was a piece of work. He was described as being deformed and unstable, suffering from mental and physical issues that have also been attributed to the inbreeding in the Spanish royal family. He was notoriously violent, unpredictable, and had a strained relationship with his father. Philip eventually had him imprisoned, and he died in captivity under mysterious circumstances, with many speculating that Philip had him killed. A bit of light family drama, just typical royal stuff. Philip's 4th wife, Anna of Austria, his niece, gave birth to Philip III, who would succeed him. Philip III, while not as physically or mentally afflicted as Charles II, still carried the genetic baggage of the Habsburgs. The famous Habsburg jaw continued to make its appearance in portraits, a prominent feature passed down through generations. The Habsburgs were truly masters of marrying each other. Take, for example, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs who united Spain and funded Christopher Columbus. Their daughter, Joanna, known as Joanna the Mad, married Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg, and their son, Charles V, inherited both the Spanish and Habsburg empires, creating a vast domain. And he, of course, married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal, keeping it nice and tight. Now, while this strategy of endogamy, marrying within a specific group, did consolidate power, it came at a significant cost in terms of genetic health. Recessive traits, which might lie dormant for generations in a more diverse gene pool, suddenly had a much higher chance of being expressed when closely related individuals reproduced. Things like hemophilia, specific facial deformities, and various other congenital conditions became more prevalent. It wasn't just the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs either. The Austrian branch also engaged in cousin marriages, though perhaps not quite with the same intensity as their Spanish relatives. Still, the impact was there. Portraits of Habsburgs across centuries often reveal similar facial features, particularly that prominent jaw and sometimes heavy eyelids, which became almost a dynastic identifier. It was a physical manifestation of their carefully controlled family tree. The motivation behind all this inbreeding was, as mentioned, primarily political. Marriage was the ultimate tool of diplomacy and power consolidation in royal Europe. By marrying within the family, the Habsburgs ensured that their vast territories remained under Habsburg control, preventing them from being fragmented by marriages into rival dynasties. It was a powerful strategy for maintaining a vast, multi-ethnic empire, but it ignored the biological consequences. It's a curious irony, isn't it? These incredibly powerful monarchs, who could command armies and dictate the fates of nations, were ultimately undone by something as fundamental as their own DNA, warped by generations of carefully orchestrated yet ultimately disastrous marital choices. They sought to create a pure, unbroken line of succession, and instead created a line increasingly prone to illness and infirmity. Let's not forget the emotional toll this took. Imagine being a royal child, born into immense privilege, yet constantly ill, struggling with physical deformities and perhaps even mental incapacities. Your entire life is dedicated to the perpetuation of your dynasty, yet your very existence makes that task incredibly difficult, if not impossible. The pressure to produce healthy heirs, especially for a king like Charles II, must have been immense and ultimately unfulfilled.
And the queens, the women brought into these families, often from other royal houses, were also victims of this system. They were expected to produce healthy children to secure the succession, often with husbands who were themselves physically or mentally challenged by their genetic heritage. It was a high-stakes game, and failure to produce an heir could have dire consequences for their own standing and influence. The Habsburg jaw, a truly iconic genetic legacy, is a perfect example of this. It's not just a quirk, it was a distinctive physical trait that was passed down through generations, becoming more pronounced with increased inbreeding. It became a kind of family crest, etched not on a shield, but on the very faces of the monarchs themselves. And while some individuals might have carried it off with a certain aristocratic hauteur, for others, like Charles II, it contributed to severe physical difficulties. So, the next time you see a portrait of a Habsburg monarch, take a moment to look at their chin. That jawline tells a story, a long, winding, and sometimes tragic tale of dynastic ambition, political strategy, and the often unforeseen consequences of trying to keep it all in the family. It's a quiet testament to the fact that even the most powerful rulers are still subject to the laws of biology, no matter how much they might try to manipulate them. Let's drift quietly now from the frosty streets of London and the convoluted family trees of the Habsburgs to another corner of royal eccentricity. We're going to talk about a monarch whose life was a whirlwind of political intrigue, personal drama, and a rather strong inclination towards the dramatic. We're talking about Queen Elizabeth I of England. While not a tale of inbreeding per se, it is certainly a tale of a dysfunctional royal family and the immense pressures placed on a monarch, particularly a female one. Elizabeth I, born in 1533, was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And right there, we have the start of a seriously messed up family situation. Her mother, Anne, was executed when Elizabeth was just 2 years old on trumped-up charges of treason, incest, and adultery because Henry wanted a son and Anne had failed to produce one. So Elizabeth spent her early life as an illegitimate child in the eyes of the law, a princess one moment, a bastard the next, depending on her father's whims and wives. Imagine growing up with that hanging over your head, your mother beheaded, your father a volatile, terrifying figure who seemed to chew through wives like they were particularly stubborn pieces of meat. Your half-sister, Mary, the devout Catholic daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who probably harbored a fair bit of resentment towards Elizabeth and her mother for usurping her own mother's place. And then your young half-brother, Edward, who became king after Henry's death and was a staunch Protestant, further complicating the religious landscape. Elizabeth's early life was a masterclass in survival. She was incredibly intelligent, well-educated, and remarkably astute, learning early on how to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. She learned to be cautious, to speak little, and to observe much. These were vital lessons for a young woman whose life was constantly in peril, especially during the reign of her half-sister, Mary I. Mary, a fervent Catholic, saw it as her divine duty to restore England to Catholicism, and Elizabeth, a Protestant symbol, whether she wanted to be or not, was a constant threat. Mary imprisoned Elizabeth in the Tower of London, a truly terrifying experience, as her own mother had been imprisoned there before her execution.
Elizabeth truly believed she was going to die. She was interrogated, suspected of treason, and lived under constant surveillance. It was a baptism of fire, teaching her invaluable lessons about power, paranoia, and the fickleness of political favor. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth, against all odds, ascended to the throne. She was 25 years old, a young woman in a man's world, expected to marry and produce an heir. But Elizabeth had other ideas. She declared herself a virgin queen, famously stating she was married to England. Now, whether she truly was a virgin is a matter of historical debate, and frankly, her business. But the political message was clear. She would not share power with a king, nor would she risk England's independence by marrying a foreign prince. This decision, however, created a massive problem: the succession. Without children, the Tudor dynasty would die with her. This led to endless speculation, pressure from Parliament, and a constant stream of marriage proposals from eligible and often very unsuitable European princes. She famously strung many of them along, playing diplomatic games, using the prospect of marriage as a political tool without ever actually committing. A brilliant, if exhausting, strategy. Her court was a fascinating, often scandalous place. Her relationship with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was particularly intense and long-lasting. He was her childhood friend, perhaps her closest confidant, and many believed he was the love of her life. Their relationship was the subject of endless gossip and speculation. Dudley was already married, and when his wife, Amy Robsad, died under mysterious circumstances, falling down a flight of stairs, rumors immediately flew that Dudley had arranged her death so he could marry the Queen. Elizabeth, ever pragmatic, knew that marrying a man whose wife had just died under suspicious circumstances would be a political disaster, and so, despite their obvious affection, they never married. Elizabeth surrounded herself with intelligent, loyal, and often ruthless advisors like William Cecil. She was a master manipulator, able to inspire fierce loyalty and strike fear into the hearts of her enemies. She cultivated her image carefully, often appearing in elaborate gowns, adorned with jewels, projecting an image of power and majesty. She was, in many ways, a performance artist on the grandest stage of all, the English throne. Her reign was marked by constant threats, both internal and external. Catholic plots to overthrow her were frequent, often centering on her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, a Catholic, was seen by many as the rightful heir to English throne, and her presence was a constant thorn in Elizabeth's side. After years of imprisonment, Elizabeth finally, reluctantly, consented to Mary's execution in 1587, a decision that weighed heavily on her, but was seen as a necessary act of self-preservation. And then there was the Spanish Armada. In 1588, Philip II of Spain, yes, our old friend, the inbred Habsburg from earlier, launched a massive fleet to invade England and restore Catholicism. Elizabeth's speech to her troops at Tilbury, "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," became legendary, a rallying cry for the nation. The defeat of the Armada, partly due to English naval skill and partly due to a rather convenient storm, was a defining moment of her reign, solidifying her popularity and England's Protestant identity. Despite her strength and political acumen, Elizabeth's personal life was often lonely. She had few truly intimate relationships, and the pressures of ruling were immense. She outlived many of her closest friends and advisors, leaving her increasingly isolated in her later years. She died in 1903 after a long and glorious reign of 44 years. With her death, the Tudor dynasty came to an end. She was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, thus uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. A neat, if somewhat ironic, twist of fate, considering her long struggle against Mary.
Elizabeth I's story is one of incredible resilience, political genius, and personal sacrifice.
She took a deeply fractured and religiously divided nation and, through sheer force of will and intelligence, molded it into a major European power. She navigated the dangers of her volatile family, the pressures of marriage and succession, and the constant threats to her throne, all while maintaining an image of unwavering strength. Her life was a testament to the power of an individual to shape destiny, even within the confines of a rigid royal system. A truly remarkable, if occasionally melancholic story. Let's now gently glide over to another example of a royal who perhaps wasn't quite cut out for the pressures of the throne, and whose life was marked by a rather tragic combination of ill health and, well, a general lack of enthusiasm for the job. We're going to talk about King George IV of the United Kingdom, who reigned from 1820 to 1830. He was, to put it mildly, a character, and not always a particularly admirable one. Born in 1762, George was the eldest son of King George III. Now, George III is famous for losing the American colonies and for his bouts of what we now understand to be mental illness, possibly porphyria. So George IV grew up with a rather difficult father figure and perhaps inherited a certain predisposition to theatricality. From a young age, George IV, as Prince of Wales, was known for his extravagance, his love of fashion, his massive debts, and his rather scandalous private life. He was a dandy of the highest order, setting fashion trends and spending enormous sums of money on clothes, palaces, and lavish parties. He built the Brighton Pavilion, a truly fantastical, Indian-inspired palace that stands as a testament to his eccentric taste and boundless spending. His personal life was a mess. He secretly and illegally married Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow, in 1785. The marriage was illegal under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required the monarch's permission for royal marriages, which George III would never have given. So Maria was his wife in his heart, but not in the eyes of the law or the state. This clandestine affair and marriage caused no end of scandal and complications. However, Parliament was pressuring him to marry a Protestant princess and produce an heir, especially given his colossal debts, which they were often asked to pay off. So, in 1795, he reluctantly married Princess Caroline of Brunswick. This marriage was a disaster from the start. They genuinely loathed each other. George reportedly said after their first meeting that he found her repulsive, and he was apparently so drunk on their wedding night that he passed out in the fireplace. Not exactly a romantic beginning, is it? They had one child, Princess Charlotte, in 1796, but after that they effectively separated, living completely separate lives. Caroline eventually left England and traveled around Europe, often causing scandals with her behavior and rumored affairs. George, meanwhile, continued his extravagant lifestyle, surrounded by mistresses and accumulating even more debt. As his father, George III, became increasingly incapacitated by his illness, George IV served as Prince Regent from 1811 to 1820. This period, known as the Regency, was a time of significant cultural and political change in Britain, but George himself was more focused on fashion, architecture, and pleasure than on governing. He was intelligent enough, but he lacked discipline and genuine interest in the more tedious aspects of kingship. When George III finally died in 1820, George IV officially became king. And what did he do almost immediately? He tried to divorce Caroline. This led to a massive public scandal known as the Trial of Queen Caroline. He tried to pass a bill in Parliament to dissolve their marriage and strip her of her title, accusing her of adultery. However, Caroline, with the support of the public, fought back fiercely. The trial captivated the nation, with the public largely siding with Caroline, seeing her as the wronged wife against her dissolute husband. The bill ultimately failed, a huge embarrassment for George IV. Caroline, ever the dramatic figure, then tried to force her way into his coronation at Westminster Abbey. She was famously turned away at the doors, a truly pathetic and public humiliation. She died shortly after, amidst rumors of poison, though it was likely a ruptured bowel. Even in death, their marital drama continued. George IV's reign was not particularly distinguished. He was known more for his indolence, his immense girth, he became incredibly obese in later life, and his continued extravagance. He was not a popular king, seen by many as selfish and self-indulgent, especially in contrast to the public's perception of his long-suffering father, George III. His health steadily declined, exacerbated by his lifestyle. He suffered from gout, dropsy or edema, and heart problems. He became increasingly reclusive, spending much of his time at Windsor Castle, indulging in food and drink. His final years were marked by illness, loneliness, and a growing sense of isolation. He died in 2030, aged 67, and was succeeded by his younger brother, William IV, as his only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, had died in childbirth in 1917, a tragedy that had plunged the nation into mourning. So George IV, a king who was called the first gentleman of Europe by some, but more often seen as a fat, dissolute, and self-serving monarch by his subjects. He embodied the excesses of the Regency era, a period of opulent spending and moral laxity, all paid for by the taxpayer. His story is one of squandered potential, of a man more interested in pleasure than duty, and of a royal life that often veered into the comically absurd, even as it caused real constitutional and social problems. A rather sad tale of a monarch who perhaps just wanted to be a very rich, very stylish private citizen. Let's now gently glide over to another royal, a queen whose life was less about personal extravagance and more about unrelenting political pressure and the tragic demands of dynastic succession. We're going to talk about Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. Her story, as we all know, ends rather dramatically, but before that, her life was a fascinating and ultimately heartbreaking tale of a young girl thrust into a role she was ill prepared for, amidst a court that was both dazzling and deeply hostile. Born an Archduchess of Austria in 1755, Marie Antoinette was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa. She was sent to France at the tender age of 14 to marry the Dauphin, the future Louis XVI. This was a classic dynastic marriage designed to cement the alliance between France and Austria, two former enemies. She arrived in France a naive, somewhat frivolous girl, unprepared for the intricate, often cruel politics of the French court at Versailles.
The gilded cage and the diamond scandal. So, where were we? Ah, yes, poor Marie Antoinette, a teenager lost in the labyrinth of Versailles. It's hard to overstate just how weird her daily life was. Imagine waking up every morning and having dozens of noblewomen watching you put on your stockings. This was the levee, a formal ritual where the highest-ranking ladies fought over who got to hand the queen her camise. To Marie, who just wanted to crawl back under the covers or go for a walk, it was an exhausting, soul-crushing performance. And because she occasionally looked bored or, heaven forbid, tried to skip the ceremonies, the court gossips began to sharpen their knives. The main issue, of course, was the lack of an heir. For 7 long years, nothing happened in the royal bedroom. Louis XVI was a perfectly nice man, but he was more interested in locksmithing and hunting than in the duties of a husband. He could tell you exactly how a complex deadbolt worked, but he was seemingly baffled by the basic mechanics of dynastic succession. The French public, meanwhile, didn't blame their king. They blamed the Austrian woman. They whispered that she was cold, or worse, that she was seeking affection elsewhere. When they finally did have children, the damage to her reputation was already done. The ink of the nasty pamphlets was dry. Marie's response to the suffocating atmosphere of the court was to retreat. She spent a fortune on the Petit Trianon, her private escape, and a mock peasant village called the Hameau de la Vemme. There, she and her friends would dress up as highly stylized, very clean milkmaids and shepherdesses.
It was the 18th century equivalent of cottagecore, but with a royal budget. She just wanted to pet perfumed goats and pretend the world outside didn't exist. But to the starving people of Paris, this wasn't a harmless hobby. It looked like a queen who was literally playing house while they couldn't afford bread. Then came the affair of the diamond necklace. This is one of those historical moments that is so ridiculous it feels like a bad sitcom plot. A con artist named Jean de la Motte convinced a high-ranking cardinal that the queen wanted a specific, obscenely expensive diamond necklace. The cardinal, desperate for the queen's favor, bought it on credit. The con artist took the diamonds, broke them up, and fled. Marie Antoinette had absolutely nothing to do with it. She didn't even like the necklace. But when the scandal broke, the public refused to believe she was innocent. To them, she was the Madame Déficit, who would steal diamonds while the country went bankrupt. As the shadows of the revolution grew longer, the king and queen remained in a sort of paralyzed state of denial. Louis XVI's diary entry for July 14, 1789, the day the Bastille fell, simply read, "Rien," nothing. He meant he hadn't killed any deer while hunting that day. Talk about missing the forest for the trees. The move from the glittering halls of Versailles to the damp prison of the Tuileries was a slow, agonizing slide. By the time she faced the guillotine in 1793, the girl who once loved powdered hair and silk ribbons was a gray-haired woman of 37, apologetically stepping on the executioner's foot. Her last words were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Even at the end, she had that polite, tragic royal grace. Floating over to the Mad King of Bavaria. Let's float away from the sharp edge of the French Revolution and drift toward the mountains of Bavaria. If you thought Marie Antoinette's fake village was extravagant, you haven't met Ludwig II of Bavaria. He was the ultimate "I'm just not built for this" king. Ludwig ascended the throne in 1864 at the age of 18. He was tall, handsome, and deeply, deeply uninterested in politics or war. Ludwig's true passion was Richard Wagner's operas and building castles that looked like they belonged on the back of a cereal box. He lived in a total fantasy world. While his ministers were trying to figure out how to navigate the rising power of Prussia, Ludwig was busy designing Neuschwanstein, the castle that eventually inspired Disney's Sleeping Beauty castle. He didn't like being seen. He became a nocturnal creature, sleeping all day and wandering his palaces at night. He would travel through the snowy Bavarian mountains in an elaborate gilded sled, dressed in historical costumes, like a lonely ghost from a different century. He once had a dinner table built on a hydraulic lift so it could emerge through the floor already set with food. Why? Because he didn't want to see the servants. He wanted to eat in total silent isolation with his imaginary friends, often spirits of French kings like Louis XIV, whom he admired far more than his own living subjects. Of course, building fairy tale castles is expensive. Ludwig spent all his personal wealth and then started borrowing heavily. When his ministers finally told him he had to stop, he simply looked for ways to replace them. Eventually, they had him declared insane by a doctor who hadn't even examined him. A few days after being deposed, Ludwig was found dead in a lake under very mysterious circumstances. Was it suicide? Was it murder? Or did he just realize that the real world was too beige for his liking? We'll never really know, but his castles remain, standing as silent, beautiful monuments to a man who preferred dreams to reality. The Boy Tsar and the Shadow of Hemophilia. Now, let's take a quiet, slow turn toward the east, to the snowy plains of Russia. We've talked about the Habsburgs and their jaws, but the Romanovs had a different kind of genetic shadow hanging over them. We're talking about Alexei Nikolaevich Nikolaevich, the last Tsarevich of Russia. Born in 1904, Alexei was the long-awaited son of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra. He was a bright, handsome little boy, but he carried a secret that could bring down an empire: hemophilia. This royal disease had been passed down from his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, the ultimate carrier who managed to spread this gene across almost every royal house in Europe. For Alexei, a simple bruise or a stubbed toe wasn't just a minor ouchie, it was a life-threatening crisis. Because his blood wouldn't clot, internal bleeding would cause his joints to swell with agonizing pain. His parents were desperate. They lived in a state of constant, vibrating anxiety, hiding his illness from the public to keep the monarchy looking strong. This desperation is what led them to Rasputin. Imagine being the Tsar of all the Russias, and you're so worried about your son that you let a bearded, unwashed holy man from Siberia run your palace because he seems to be the only one who can stop the boy's bleeding through prayer or hypnosis. It was a PR nightmare. The Russian people saw a strange monk influencing the Tsarina, and they assumed the worst. Alexei himself was a sweet child who just wanted to play, but he spent much of his life being carried around by a giant sailor because he wasn't allowed to run or jump. He once said, "When I am dead, it will not hurt anymore." It's a heartbreaking thought, a child whose entire existence was a balance between extreme privilege and extreme fragility. The tragedy of the Romanovs wasn't just the political revolution that ended them. It was the quiet, private misery of a family trying to protect a boy who was broken from the inside out. As we end this part of our journey, imagine the silence of the Winter Palace, the muffled footsteps on thick carpets, and the flickering candlelight reflecting off the gold icons. The world was changing outside, but inside, they were just parents, terrified of a single scratch.
The king who talked to trees and the queen who wouldn't leave. Let's drift back across the English Channel, away from the tragic Romanovs, and settle into the damp green gardens of Kew. We need to talk about King George III. Now, history books usually remember him as the king who lost America, or the Mad King, but that's a bit uncharitable. In reality, George was a remarkably dedicated man, a bit of a nerd, if we're being honest. He loved agriculture, earning him the nickname Farmer George. He was obsessed with the timing of clocks and the movement of the stars. But as the years ticked by, his mind began to fray in the most peculiar ways. During his bouts of illness, which modern doctors suspect was porphyria, a genetic blood disorder, George didn't just become angry, he became relentless. He would talk for 24 hours straight until his voice grew hoarse and his foam-flecked lips couldn't keep up with his racing thoughts. There's a famous, perhaps slightly exaggerated story that he once pulled his carriage over to the side of the road and spent a long afternoon having a very serious, very polite conversation with an oak tree under the impression that it was the King of Prussia. His doctors, who were about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, subjected him to horrific treatments. They blistered his skin with hot cups and forced him into a primitive version of a straitjacket. Through all this, his wife, Queen Charlotte, watched in a state of quiet, frozen horror. Their household, once a model of boring domestic bliss, became a silent museum of grief. George would have periods of lucidity where he would play the harpsichord and weep for the man he used to be before drifting back into the fog. It's a slow, quiet tragedy, the most powerful man in the world, lost in the woods of his own mind, talking to trees while his empire shifted beneath his feet. The Queen of Portugal and the Great Escape. While George III was debating with Oakes, another royal drama was unfolding in Portugal with Queen Maria I. She is often called Maria the Pious or Maria the Mad, depending on how much sympathy you have for a woman who lived through an absolute nightmare. Maria was deeply religious, the kind of religious where you see demons in every shadow. The real breaking point for her was a series of personal tragedies. Within a few short years, she lost her husband,
her eldest son, and her favorite daughter. To a mind already prone to melancholia, this felt like divine punishment. She began to scream throughout the night, her cries echoing through the cold stone hallways of the Queluz palace. She believed her father's soul was a calcined pile of ashes being tortured by invisible forces. But the truly surreal part of Maria's story happened in 1807. Napoleon's army was marching toward Lisbon, and the Portuguese royal family decided there was only one thing to do: pack up the entire government and move it to Brazil. Imagine the scene: thousands of nobles, servants, and crates of silver being shoved onto ships in a panicked rush. Queen Maria was forced onto a boat, clutching her prayer beads, screaming that the servants were trying to kidnap her. She spent the rest of her life in Rio de Janeiro, a queen in exile, wandering through tropical gardens while dressed in the heavy black mourning veils of a cold European court. She never returned to Portugal. She lived in a perpetual loop of prayer and panic, a woman whose mind stayed in the dark cathedrals of Lisbon while her body sat in the bright Brazilian sun. It's that classic royal contrast: all the land in the world, but no peace in the head. The sad, sickly life of the Sun King's heirs. Let's float back to France for a moment, but earlier this time, to the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. He was the pinnacle of royal power, the man who built Versailles and made every noble in France compete to see who could hold his candle at night. He lived for 77 years, a record-breaking run. But there is a very quiet, very dark irony to his long life. Because Louis lived so long, he outlived almost everyone who was supposed to replace him. First his son died, then his grandson died, then his great-grandson died. It was like a slow-motion collapse of a family tree. By 1712, the greatest king in the world was sitting in his golden palace, surrounded by ghosts. The only heir left was a 2-year-old boy, the future Louis XV. This little boy grew up in a world where he was treated like a fragile piece of porcelain. He was constantly surrounded by doctors who wanted to bleed him with leeches and tutors who wanted to mold him into a god. It's no wonder that when he finally took the throne, he was a man plagued by a profound, unshakable boredom. He had ennui before it was cool. He famously said, "After me, the deluge," basically acknowledging that the whole royal system was a sinking ship, but he was too tired to grab a bucket. He spent his days in private apartments, making coffee and avoiding his ministers, a king who had been spoiled by tragedy and expectations until there was nothing left but a hollow gilded shell. The irony of royal leisure. If you're still awake, or if you're just drifting on the edge of sleep, think about the sheer weight of these lives. We often envy the leisure of the elites, but their leisure was often just a different kind of prison. Whether it was George III trapped in his madness, Maria I trapped in her grief, or Louis XV trapped in his boredom, these figures were less like rulers and more like ornaments. They were the centers of worlds that were increasingly falling apart. They were forced to marry people they didn't like, to produce children who might inherit their worst traits, and to maintain a face of divine perfection while their bodies and minds were very much human and very much failing. It's all a bit ironic, isn't it? They had the finest silks, the most expensive jewelry, and the grandest palaces, but they couldn't buy a quiet night's sleep or a mind free of the shadows of their ancestors. Let's leave them there for now, in their draughty palaces and their troubled dreams. The candles are burning low, the coal in the grate is turning to ash, and the heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the world outside.